This is going to be a little bit different, I have to say, because we're in the Calder Valley. You'll be pleased to hear it's snowing outside. We've got a white perspective and all the traffic, and we're just going to get the sledge out. So I'll crack on. Not all houses, not all rooms give their use away quite so well as this one. This is a house called Hollins, just outside Hebden Bridge, and you'll notice that above the window they've put the sign that this is the dairy. Of course, this doesn't date from when the house was built, which is probably in the late 16th century. This is the window tax coming in and allowing us to identify what was going on in this room in that period, particularly. Sorry. So where are we? Okay, we're in the Calder Valley in the old West Riding of Yorkshire, and we're dealing with the largest parish in that area, the old ancient parish of Halifax, which I've put around in a square block there. So, and to get you close in a little bit further, here's an extract from Christopher Saxton's map of the 1570s. Here's Halifax, you can see, and the Calder Valley, River Calder coming up through the valley here. I'll just point out in a couple of places here. Shibden Hall, of course, will be familiar to people who, especially to fans of Anne Lister and the Gentleman Jack television programme. Very fine building, see a picture in a minute. One or two other important buildings around here. Elland Hall, although no longer there, was discovered to be timber framed when they started knocking it down for the creation of a motorway. Bypass, I should say. And we have several other halls, as you'll notice, throughout the area. Now, the Calder Valley, generally, people have a rather gloomy outlook on the Calder Valley. This is Sorby Bridge, back in the 1930s. As you can see, the mills, plenty of them, chimneys, some smoking still, and rows of terraced houses. Interestingly, though, the building of these towns in the late 18th through the 19th century into the early 20th century actually created a situation where some of the existing properties that were there were converted, covered up, and some indeed knocked down. More usual for the Calder Valley is this kind of scene. This is a little bit further up the valley with the odd mill, but several farmsteads dotted around in various different parts up on the hillside, you can see. And I think you'll notice that many of them are quite close together. Further up the valley still, we've got Hebden Bridge. Hebden Bridge today is very clearly a 19th into the 20th century town. It's built on the site of the crossing of the Calder Valley, of the Calder and the Hebble rivers. And here we have some very interesting looking houses, some very tall houses indeed, like these. No longer with us now, but look reasonable set of houses, a set of buildings. These are tenements indeed. You can see various different doorways on the ground floor there. They look reasonably okay from that side. From this side, however, which is around the back, you can get the picture of the cramped conditions that people were actually living in. And interestingly, of course, some of these buildings, not this one, but some of these buildings were actually converted from other houses. So the Calder Valley, again, a couple of slightly more cheery landscapes here for you. Again, farms dotted across the hillsides. One of the features is from around here, from the 16th, 17th century onwards, that there was enclosure going up onto the tops of the moors. And you can see several farms which resulted from this kind of enclosure being developed here. They're all fairly small. The big farms we don't really do in the Calder Valley at all. Another view, some snow on the tops. There we are. It's a bit of what it's looking like now outside. And again, Calder Valley, a bit wooded, which is something else we need to remember. Calder River running through the middle here, and the Rochdale Canal as well. And again, farmhouses, farms dotted around in the area. When Daniel Defoe trundled through in the early part of the 18th century, he found people all full of business, not a beggar, not an idle person to be seen. except here and there an almshouse, where people ancient, decrepit, and past labour might perhaps be found. And Daniel Defoe went on to describe how amongst the large houses there were lots of cottages where the lusty fellows could be seen working away. Halifax itself, which was the major town, had the parish church and so on. Very interesting town. If you visit it today, you'll get a very clear picture of a Victorian town that has been developed during the 60s and the 70s. It's managed to retain quite a lot of its Victorian buildings, unlike some of the surrounding ones, Bradford, for example, Leeds as well, and Huddersfield as well. Halifax has retained the Victorian buildings. It has retained very few, however, of the timber frame buildings, of which you can see from this illustration, this print that was produced in the late 19th century, there were quite a few timber frame buildings, tall timber frame buildings, and jetted, and almost all of these have disappeared now. I think that one we saw in the middle there, the White Swan, I think the illustrator used a bit of artistic license, because the White Swan just before it was demolished in 1858 does look a little bit further, as if it's come down a bit further. It was one of the main coaching inns, and before that almost certainly one of the main stopping points for people travelling through. Shibden Hall, there we are, mentioned it earlier on. Timber framed house. It's one of the few good timber framed houses surviving in the area, and of course one you can visit, but it's had several interesting developments, and room use has changed quite considerably. The West Yorkshire Archaeology Service did a very good little leaflet about it, which I hope you can still pick up there, and you can get an idea of the development of the house from, on the left hand side, on the 15th century building, which we think that's roughly when it was built, through to the 20th century. Main changes, of course, being stone clad in places, and huge 19th century additions, which don't really show up on the left hand side or on the right hand side, but quite clearly the house has been extended. What else you'll notice, of course, is that the hall, or here, which was an open hall, has been changed slightly, although it still is an open hall. It's now had windows put in, and the whole walling has been brought forward slightly. So we have on the one side then an open hall. The best parlour still is a very fine room indeed. On the other side of the cross passage we have the lower parlour, and these upstairs was, we believe, was one of the private rooms used by Anne Lister, just to bring back to her again. A smaller building, not far from Shibden Hall, but we're coming down to the kind of scale of buildings that I'm going to be talking about, is this one in Boothtown. Boothtown's a suburb of Halifax. It was a separate community just outside Halifax, just to the north of Halifax, and home, as we'll see in a moment, to some very what were some very impressive buildings. This is a kind of a newcomer to that little group. Built in the middle of the 17th century, an interesting house, not particularly typical for the Halifax area, I have to say. It's almost what you might call an urban style building. We have a central doorway here with chamber above it, and then it's flanked on either side by probably what were parlours, and on the upper floor chambers. So slightly unusual from that point of view. You've got a lobby entry plan here, and some very characteristic features, the mullioned and transom windows. And then on the first floor we have the hood mould with these wonderful decorated stops, terminals, which the Halifax area is noted for. There are more, I suspect, around here than many other parts of the country. Or maybe we could discuss that later on. If you'd been there 60, 70 years ago, you'd have been able to look down this street towards that building. There it is at the end, or part of it anyway. These buildings on the right are still there, but on the left hand side we have a road. You can just see the gable here with Leyland Street written on it, and this is one of the buildings that was surveyed in the 1950s and early 1960s by and produced as a result this article on old houses in the Halifax area. On the left is the corner of the building we saw, is just up here. This is the road looking down towards Boothtown House. And this building here, clearly has fallen on slightly hard times. And looking you can see inserted doorways here with these single piece stone surrounds and so on, rather dilapidated looking privies probably to the side of the building and so on. This is the other side of the building with a block towards the rear, again with doorways and so on. And a third building in the area which has also come down rather in status. You can see here there's this mullioned and transomed window also upstairs, and here are the hood mould stops again. An aisled roof, sliding roof, double-storey porch here, and some later building added onto the left-hand side there. Well, this was interpreted by Atkinson and McDowell. Now, Frank Atkinson was we're fortunate to have had him before he moved up to Beamish. He was one of the people that instituted the Folk Museum at Shibden Hall and developed the museum there, and was there to actually see these buildings and record these buildings before they were knocked down. And you can see that we have a plan here of this particular building you see on the right there, of the building in Sladden Street. And he identified, or despite the fact that the building had been divided up into smaller cottages and tenements, a hall with a crosswing and aisles on either side, which he found quite unusual. There we are. There's the where we were with the buildings. This is let's start. There's Boothtown House, the one we looked at, a small stone building we looked at first of all, and then we were in what's called here Trough Street. It became called Hall Street later on. The one building we looked at there, turns out when they took it down in the early 1960s, or late 1960s, beg your pardon, that it turned out that this was a L-shaped timber framed house with integral framing, and that's been written up by John Gilkes in the Yorkshire Archaeological Journal. And then further buildings of this sort, and the clue quite often on a town plan like this is, whereas you've got the very regular back-to-backs on the left over there, these higgledy-piggledy looking plan forms are a clue to what might have been a timber framed, or at least a much older building. And this is indeed the fate of what happens to many of the houses, the older houses in the Halifax area. This is the plan, the map from the Aisled Houses book, or journal, I should say, where it was published, and you can see that they identified a substantial number of aisled halls in the area. Sadly, sad to say, some of them have disappeared. This little group here we were looking at just now, Scout Hall Farm has disappeared. High Bentley is still there, and despite the best efforts of a demolition company in Bradford, has actually survived and has been restored. These two on this side of the Calder both have gone, following redevelopment in the mid 20th century. So what I thought I'd look at as 3 case studies for the area, large, middle, small, more or less. This is How Royd in Barkisland, a stone-built house. This is a house from 1638. The date is on one of the doorways, we'll see in a moment. For whatever reason, the family who built this, the Horton family, decided they were going to retain an open hall at a time when many other buildings in the Calder Valley, built in stone, the open hall was being abandoned. But this is slightly upper. This is this is gentry status, lower gentry status, I must admit, but that's as good as it gets in the Halifax area in the 17th century. And at either end we have cross wings. The one on the left being refenestered, as you can see, the one on the right too, with slightly larger windows, and these cross wings provided parlours for the family. And the house, there we have the 2 doorways to the cross passage, which, as you'd expect, is there. One of them has the date on it and a appropriate little inscription on it. These types of porches and entrances were quite common in the sort of mid 17th century. We've got several examples of them, and cross passage leading in, and in this case going onto the one side leading onto the hall, the other side onto the parlour, and probably at the rear of the property with service rooms as well. Here we have the interpretation from Rural Houses of West Yorkshire, excellent volume produced in 1986, following the Royal Commission's survey of 200 or 300 properties in the old parish of Halifax, and they managed to put together the rooms based on William Horton's inventory of 1655. He's the builder of the house, dies 20 years later, and a very thorough inventory is made, and you can see the interpretation. Interestingly, we have here not a service end but a shop. And a shop, this is actually a workshop, of course, and remember we are in the textile area of Yorkshire, and it of course is in the Halifax parish that the textile weaving and marketing of the textiles developed and allowed the properties, some of these kind of properties, to be built with the new prosperity, and parlours and so on, and then service rooms to the rear of the property there. In the 19th century, a drawing or sketch was made here of Howroyd. This is your open hall with a gallery on the right-hand side, rather wonderful plasterwork on the ceiling there, and we're pleased to say it is actually still there. Our second example, coming down the scale a bit, this is a yeoman's house called Old Edge in Heptonstall. The picture on the right comes out of the local collection, the Pennine Horizons collection, collected together lots of photographs from there, many of them based on a photographer from the 20th century, and also collections from a gentleman called Ralph Cross, who was very active in the area in the 1950s and the 1960s. Although he lived in Burnley, he recognised that if he came over to Yorkshire, he'd actually see some good houses. No, that's totally prejudicial. Here is the house as the photo he took. You'll notice that there's been a certain amount of reuse going on. We've got two doorways plonked in here, and I wouldn't be at all surprised if that end hadn't been used for animals. Here's the house today, been restored quite substantially, mullion windows reinstated or perhaps put in, and we can have a look first of all at the doorway, and a rather nice inscription on it. I love it. It's got "Peace be within thy gate," and apparently in the Bible the proper quotation has an S on the end, so someone has kindly added the S at the end there. And TG, the initials for the family who built it, the Greenwood family, very common name in the area. Thomas Greenwood this was. Here's a drawing of the house. We surveyed it in 1991 when I was just getting into vernacular architecture, and you can see the porch, two-storey porch there, and the windows, double chamfered mullion windows, and the restoration has also put in double chamfered mullion windows, much smaller windows on the upper floor, but we've got a full two-storey house here. And better still, we have an inventory slightly later, 1713, which lists a whole series of rooms, and I've tried to locate them all in this house. It doesn't quite work, but we do have the house body, the hall, large room centered there with previously presumably had a Bessemer carrying across, and the fireplace here, the cross passage called in the inventory the entry, the shop end, workshop end of the ground, and the old parlour, and he's built a new parlour by 1713 on the rear of the property. So there on the left hand side you have a list of the rooms, starting with the house body, and that is actually in the order in which they took the inventory. And I find that interesting because if you try and follow the inventory around the house, you realize that they were up and downstairs quite a lot. We upstairs in the new parlour and chamber over, we carry on round to the old parlour, so downstairs again, up again to the old parlour, chamber, over the chamber of the house, the cyc house. A cyc house usually is associated with water, but couldn't pin that down at all here. The entry chamber, so we've got a little chamber in the porch here or over the entry itself. Shop and shop chamber, outhouse and barn. So Andrew mentioned the values. He has in goods £78, quite a substantial sum, above average for the Calder Valley at this time, although there are people who do have over £1,000 when their inventory is taken. He has £3 owing to him in credit. Sadly, he is in debt to the tune of £79, so his estate isn't going to be worth all that much if you can take all that at face value. Okay, I'll skim over this a little bit because there is a lot to take in here. Basically, the house body, as you can see, is being used Well, it is being used not only for storing, we have some things. It's also being used for cooking, apparently. So it seems anyway, with some of the different items here: pans, spittles, range, tongs, runners, and so on. The buttery, apart from being a kind of preparation storage room, and has in it, which I rather like, a one silver spoon. They seem to have lighted on one of his proud possessions. Okay, the new parlour, clearly a room being used for, I would have thought, certainly for sleeping, bed, 3 chairs and cushions and so on. So this is being used. The new parlour is actually being used instead. It sounds as the old parlour as being their best room. And interestingly enough, that's at the back of the house. In the other parlour, we have here the bedding again being used, and also storage area for it as well. At the other end, then, we've got as we might expect in a shop, we've got looms, but also being used for storage and so on. The upper deck of the house, the chambers, and we have, interestingly, a bed and bedding in the chamber. In some of the houses, certainly in the 17th century, the chamber over the house is purely used for storage, and we have all sorts of things stored there. Ark and horse corn, these are kind of chests. Over the entry chamber, we have all sorts of storage again, bedding, but no bed actually listed. The shop chamber purely being used for working tools, chests and harrows. And in the old chamber, again, bed and bedding, and again for storage as well. The outhouse and the barn, just mention those. In the outhouse, we have milk bowls and wood vessels. You might guess that's perhaps a dairy. And then in the barn, we have various lists of animals, and then various husbandry efforts as well. The third one, I'm not going to talk about this building. It's a very interesting building looking down the Calder Valley, or up, sorry, I should say up the Calder Valley. Hebden Bridge is up in the valley up there. This house, Stannery End, a very typical house, 3-cell house with a cross passage, shop at one end, house body or hall, and the parlour at the other end. But what I want to do is to go slightly around the corner, round the hillside. So Hebden Bridge is over there, and this is a house that we surveyed also when I was new to the area in 1991. As you can see, basically a single-storey house, which I think is quite interesting. And from the other end, mostly single-storey, certainly single-storey here, but with a room towards the end here. Now, this is a very intriguing building. Inside there is a range of timber framing. It seems to have been partly timber framed, if not completely timber framed at one stage, and then cased in stone, although that's it is difficult to say because there have been so many changes inside. But what are we looking at? Well, I think we're looking at a central hall or house body, and this will only be a single-storey house body, so presumably open to the roof. Cross passage here, shop at this end, and then at this end, presumably a parlour with some storage space over it as well. So again, it's following that kind of format, that kind of situation with what was the passage here, side of the Bressumer, which was pretty clear to see in there, the shop end here, and the parlour at this end here. Interestingly, when this house had fallen in status to become a small farmhouse, and then it had been actually split into two, we had actually these people are living in this fairly remote spot, and there have been additions at this end to make it into a 2-storey building with stairs going up and down, and taking the lie of the land. In other words, the land is going downhill over to the left of the picture. The last one I'll talk about is Little Brackenbed. This is a house on the edge of Halifax, just outside Halifax, but a very interesting house from the simple point of view that actually it is one of the few buildings that we actually have a bit of evidence for what is going on there from the point of view of it being altered and being built. And we have here a building contract from 1704 between a Dr. Threepland of Ovenden, who was quite a wealthy medical man in the Halifax area, and 2 masons, Matthew Sutcliffe and Thomas Schofield. And Matthew and Thomas agreed to do work for Samuel Threepland at this building, and the building is, as you can see, it was when these photos were taken, it was in rather sad condition, and needed another couple of masons to come along at the beginning of the 20th century as well as at the beginning of the 18th century. But essentially what we've got is a rear wing here, with the house strangely faces into the hillside. It's more, well, that is the southern aspect of it. And well, what have we got here? Maybe it looks rather like on the left-hand side here as if we have a fire window and a house body, but that'll be a bit more clear in a moment. What I think we have is the kitchen wing, which we were just looking at, across passage here, a shop at one end, and the parlour here. That's how we think it developed. It's quite difficult to tell because when we got to see it, it was actually been divided into three. One dwelling in the parlour, one in the house body, and one in the kitchen. So as you can imagine, quite a few changes had taken place. And here's the actual changes that the masons were asked to do. And they said, right, we'll build and erect one gable end from the ground between the house body and the parlour. So between those two rooms, with three chimneys in that wall, and another gable end between the entry and the house body. It's kind of implying that you're building up stonework where something else has been previously, and I would guess something else is timber framing. But there's no real evidence of a fully timber framed house there. And here we have, this is the kitchen wing. You can see there on the right, this is the cross passage. The shop has been rebuilt fairly substantially. Just further on up the road here, there was a brewery at one stage in the 19th century. So this is the kitchen and the kitchen chamber built there, and this is my little diagram to show what I think happened there. So here are walls being built up between the walls being erected between the various rooms, the cross passage here and the shop at that end, and between the parlour and the chamber. And here are three flues being put in. I would assume two at the parlour end and one in the house body, and a flue there. So that raises a bit of an interesting question. I'm not sure what that flue is, if it's serving the shop. Kitchen wing there at the rear wasn't, I don't think, wasn't altered in this part of the reconstruction. And we have some of the early words coming in here. A pan piece that joins on the barn in the shop. I'm not exactly sure what that was talking about. We have obviously a barn that seems to be connected onto the house at the far end, at the shop end of the house. We've also got to mention here, they'll put in a new stone window of 6 lights. That is actually still there, and they will thatch all the same building. Well, that's not, thatch is, in this case, in West Yorkshire, we say thack. And a thack means we're putting thack stones on the roof. And it's been summarised in Yorkshire Buildings, the magazine of the Yorkshire Vernacular Building Study Group in 2018. So a bit just to say what some of this work is based on. Rural houses of West Yorkshire sitting in the middle there, which I'm sure many people will know about. Noble Seed of Industry on the right hand side, which is, although a slim volume, it's packed full of interesting points, developing how the various industries in the area developed. And then Louis Ambler's book, also well known. And then some of the studies that have been done. We mentioned Atkinson and McDowell. Christopher Stell's 1960s thesis, pretty difficult to actually get a view of it. There's one copy in Halifax Library, the other copy's in at Liverpool, where he studied. There's an article in Pennine Houses which is well worth reading, and his stuff is still, I would say, the basis for some of the studying that's gone on. And then other ones, Winwesterdales, the Houses of Shibden Dale, which is the area around Shibden Hall, the Lathe Houses of Upland, West Yorkshire. And the inventories we've studied over the last, I suppose, 10, 15 years, a group of us have been looking at the inventories for a period of 10, 12 years. The sad note about the inventories is despite, although we have one or two for the 17th century, there are very few. So it makes comparison work quite problematic. But we have from 1688, a very good run of inventories all the way through the 18th century, and we've been mining the first half of the first few years of that, and published these books here about the various probate records. And we've looked at all the documents as far as we could, the will where it exists, an inventory, and the other documents as well. So we think they will make very interesting links for family historians as well. Here are the contact details. for the Yorkshire Vernacular group, and there's my own personal one if you've got any points you would like to make, and at that point I will stop.